Here in the United States, we tell stories about the Pilgrims, the intrepid band of religious refugees who fled across the Atlantic Ocean in the early 17th century to build a new life here in what would become New England. It's a story we tell most often around Thanksgiving time, and usually it goes something like this. In the year 1620, 102 men, women, and children aboard the Mayflower set sail from England for the New World. After 66 days at sea, they landed near present-day Plymouth, Massachusetts, where they established the Plymouth Colony, the first permanent English settlement in New England. The Pilgrims, as they became known, were separatists who wanted to break away from the Church of England. They sought religious freedom, and they found it here. They were welcomed by the native people who had lived here for generations, and over time the Pilgrims and their descendants grew to become the dominant culture of New England, shaping its politics, its society, and its future. That story has been told and retold so many times that we Americans have come to accept it as fact. But if you dig into the history of the Pilgrims, you discover that they were far from the noble progenitors of American democracy, and the United States was far from their final destination. In fact, the story of the Pilgrims began not in England but right here in the heart of England's unruly neighbor, Nottinghamshire. Welcome to my channel. I make these videos because there are stories everywhere. They're all around us, and sometimes those stories can change the way we see things. Sometimes those stories can even change the way we see ourselves. This is the Market Square in Nottingham, a bustling city in the East Midlands of England. In the 16th century, it was home to a secret congregation of Protestant radicals known as the Separatists. These were the Pilgrims before they were pilgrims, the men and women who would flee here to escape the wrath of an increasingly Catholic England, and eventually sail across the ocean to North America. To understand how the Pilgrims ended up here, though, we have to go back even further. See, the Church of England was once very different than it is today. For much of its early history, it was in conflict with the Roman Catholic Church, and when King Henry VIII broke with the Pope in 1534 and declared himself the head of the Church of England, the nation's religious landscape shifted dramatically. Now a state religion, the Church of England became intertwined with the political power of the Crown, which led to years of turmoil as monarchs battled to maintain control of both the church and the kingdom. During this time, a group of devout Protestants emerged, who believed that the Church of England had strayed too far from the teachings of Christ and had become too closely allied with the powers that be. Known as the Puritans, these reformers wanted to purify the Church of England of what they saw as Catholic corruption and excess. Some of them sought to reform the Church from within, while others, known as the Separatists, believed that true worship could only be found outside the church altogether. In the 1560s, the Separatists began holding secret meetings in places like this, in barns and sheds and private homes where they could practice their form of worship without detection. This was dangerous, however, because if the authorities found out, they risked arrest, imprisonment, or worse. By the time Elizabeth I came to power in 1558, the Separatists had grown bolder and more numerous. Though still considered a heretical sect, they were mostly left alone. However, the Queen's successor, the young James I, was a lot less tolerant. See, James wanted to project an image of a more unified, less volatile kingdom, and he saw no place in it for troublesome separatists. In 1593, a series of laws known as the Star Chamber Acts were passed which aimed to crack down on separatist activity, forcing many of them to flee into exile. They went to places like Holland and Switzerland where they could practice their religion freely. But some separatists remained hidden in England, going into greater secrecy than ever before. And it was here that a group of these separatists began plotting an escape, not to Holland or Switzerland, but somewhere else entirely, somewhere far beyond the reach of the English crown, somewhere in North America. The next time you walk past a pub, take a moment to appreciate just how long these buildings have stood. Here in the United States, our ideas of ancient are pretty skewed. We think of things like the pyramids and Stonehenge and the Colosseum. But most of Europe's cities weren't built all that long ago, and the streets we walk along today are the same ones that were here 500 years ago, and will likely be here another 500 years from now. That's why when you travel to a place like Nottingham, you get the sense that you've stepped back in time. It's a place where centuries-old buildings still stand, and where cobblestone streets wind through the old town centre. And it's here that the story of the Pilgrims truly began. These are the remains of St. Mary's Church, which stands at the edge of Nottingham's bustling market square. Back when it was built in the 12th century, it was the center of a community that looked a lot different than it does today. Most of the people living here were poor, working folks, farmers and tradesmen and women. Life wasn't easy. Famine and disease were common. Religion was a source of comfort, and this church was at the heart of that. But everything changed during the Reformation when the Church of England broke with Rome, and as the country grappled with questions of faith and politics, people began to drift away from the church. By the time the Separatists arrived, the old ways of worship were gone, and in their place was growing discontent. In a book called The Pilgrim Fathers and the Founding of New England, author Francis Hill describes how the Separatists operated in this environment. Quote, "The Separatists held their meetings in private houses, probably in barns or upper rooms, and must have used every precaution to prevent discovery. The fact that such congregations existed is proof that the leaders were brave and resolute, that the members were ready to endure much hardship, and that the movement had strong support. We don't know the exact number of Separatists who lived here, nor do we know who exactly they were. What we do know is that they were a diverse bunch from all walks of life, young and old, rich and poor. All that we know for sure is that they were searching for something better, whatever that may have been." One of the most prominent Separatist preachers here in Nottingham was a man named John Robinson. He was born in 1569 in a village just outside the city, and by the late 1590s he was a respected minister at the nearby village of Gainsborough. When Separatism took hold in Nottingham, Robinson helped lead the congregation in secret, and it was here that they faced their greatest challenge. On January 22, 1606, a member of the congregation spilled the beans, telling the authorities about their secret gatherings. Almost immediately, raids were conducted on Separatist homes. People were arrested and charged, and several were sent to prison. Others, fearing for their safety, fled into hiding. Among them was John Robinson, who went on the run to avoid arrest. Where exactly he went is not known, but we do know that he would spend the next 6 years in hiding, moving constantly to stay ahead of the authorities. It was during this time that Robinson became acquainted with William Brewster, a fellow Separatist minister who also had been forced into hiding. Together they would plan for a future free of persecution, and one day they would find it in a place few Englishmen had ever heard of, a place where no king could touch them, a place called America. To be continued. America, of course, would go on to become the dominant culture of New England, but that wasn't the original vision of the Pilgrims. When they landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620, they had no intention of creating a new country. They simply wanted a place to worship God freely. But as we learned in Part 1, that dream was threatened from the start when the Mayflower, carrying 102 passengers, wound up on the shores of what is today Cape Cod, 25 miles north of their intended destination. When they finally made their way to Plymouth, they found it occupied by the Wampanoag, a Native American tribe that had lived here for hundreds of years. To survive in this new land, the Pilgrims needed the Wampanoag's help, and in exchange, they offered to teach the natives the ways of Christianity. This worried some of the Pilgrims, including William Brewster, who feared that their religion would become corrupted in the process. Yet as the colony grew, so did the desire for independence, and by the end of the 17th century, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had become its own self-governing entity, free from the control of the Church of England. It was not until after the American Revolution that the region became the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and later the United States, and it was not until much later still that the story of the Pilgrims was corrupted to become a cornerstone of American national identity, but it happened nonetheless. Today, Plymouth, Massachusetts is a popular destination for school trips, and every year in November we gather around a national holiday to celebrate the Pilgrims' arrival, and the harvest feast they shared with the Wampanoag, an event that has morphed into the popular but controversial celebration of Thanksgiving. Of course, the legacy of the Pilgrims isn't all positive. As we learned earlier, the pursuit of religious freedom didn't extend to everyone else, and the Pilgrims played a key role in the forced removal of native tribes from their ancestral lands. Still, their story endures, in part because it helped shape the character of the United States, and in part because it taught us the importance of understanding where our stories come from. If you want to learn more about the origins of the Pilgrims, check out the additional resources, and thanks so much for watching.